Welcome to the Operation Weed Eradication report on Brownfield. I'm anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is Bryan Young with Purdue University. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Megan. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you for taking some time to chat with us today. We're going to talk about weed control, weed eradication, and weed management. But to start today, let's talk a little bit about this growing season and how things are looking as it comes down to crop development, but also weed challenges that growers may be facing.
Sure. Well, so far in this geography, central Indiana or Indiana in general, it's been cooler than normal. And so that has slowed crop growth and development. From a weed management standpoint, that can translate to some of your mostly problematic weeds like water hemp isn't growing as fast. It's off to a slower start, but some of the grasses like giant foxtail and giant ragweed have been growing fairly well. And so they might be your trigger weeds for your post applications. But also having the cooler conditions has resulted in maybe delaying our canopy closure for our crops, which can also supplement weed control.
So does that mean for farmers who are scouting and looking at crop development, looking at weed challenges, that maybe they need to look a little bit longer and we may be having to address these issues a little bit later in the growing season than we're used to?
Yeah, it might mean that with their post application that might need to go on, maybe a couple weeks ago or maybe in the next coming weeks, that maybe they need a residual herbicide along with that, kind of this overlapping residual, which they might not have thought they needed before, but now it might be necessary because they're not close to their canopy closure.
Bryan, when we talk about weed control and weed management, we also talk about weed eradication. That's the title of this report. That seems like a pretty monumental task and a big ask and a big challenge for growers. Is this something that's tangible for us to eradicate these tough to control and problematic weeds?
Well, complete eradication is, like you said, monumental. It takes a lot of effort, and you have to wonder about the profitability of that. But I think we have to be thinking about if we were to do that, try and eradicate it, what practices would we implement? Is it more than just herbicides? Back when Roundup ready crops were at their peak and Roundup was working very well, we thought we had the herbicide that was going to eradicate all weeds. And turns out that didn't happen, right? We needed more than just, herbicide use to keep on top of these weeds and be more sustainable. So it's really thinking about what would we do if we wanted to eradicate weeds? What other tools or practices are necessary?
How important is it for us to look at an option or a control method that's beyond a herbicide to address these issues and to work toward eradication?
Well, you always like to mix up your weed management practices from an annual basis or maybe even throughout the year. Frankly, we have a lot of corn and soybean production in the Midwest, and that's not enough to confuse the weeds anymore. So since we don't have crop rotation, well, that probably makes it more important to have different practices that we implement other than herbicides. So a common one that's taken off in the last 5, 10 years have been cover crops. That can supplement a herbicide program. I'm not saying replace, but a good supplement to a herbicide program. There's other mechanical means for weed control. You're hearing a lot more about in-row cultivation by some, harvest weed seed control practices like a hammer mill in the back of your combine to help destroy some of the seeds so that you don't have viable seed going to the soil. So there are different things that can be considered.
When we talk about efficacy and the ability to use these products for years to come, how do we protect the technologies that we have and the ones that are coming down the pipeline?
Well, I think what you got to think about is, when herbicide resistance has evolved, it's typically been to the last herbicide you sprayed for the year. And so that's a post-emergence herbicide. Maybe it's a rescue, maybe it wasn't. But, hopefully in your corn or in your soybeans, you're not using the same herbicide as your last, line of defense in each. You're using some other practice. If it is that same herbicide, maybe you do use something like harvest weed seed control practices, or you're doing something that at least reduces the sheer amount of weeds that you're spraying in a post application using good residual herbicide programs. And I know that can be a challenge when we've talked about drought and dry conditions. Well, how is a soil residual herbicide going to work under droughty conditions? Well, not as good as under more optimal conditions, but they still provide a great value. Even in 2012, that great drought that we had, in 12, we still saw a value of residual herbicides.
Let's talk a little bit about, as you work with growers, as you talk to growers, how do you help them put a plan in place that works for them and addresses that last weed standing, and to make sure that they're controlling the problematic weeds as best as they can?
Well, it still has a lot to do with keeping an eye on the field. You know, are we scouting the field, or at least making some observations for that last sprayer pass or whatever the last pass might be for that field, to know what weeds are present? There's still some confusion about what is a pigweed, what is a water hemp, what is Palmer amaranth, which is disappointing. But I understand that farmers are tasked with a lot of things that they need to keep up on. Weed management isn't the only thing that they have to do. So just understanding what weeds they have, what resistance could be there, understand the different herbicide mode of action groups. And if it's resistant to one herbicide in that group, it's probably resistant to the other herbicide in that group as well. And how can they supplement that? Cover crops is a popular one right now in some geographies. Mechanical means, tillage prior to planting is a good way to control our horseweed or a mare's tail, but it has to be the right type of tillage event. Not all tillage is designed to actually control horseweed.
Dr. Young, anything else today?
Well, I appreciate the time, but I would say that, just as if I were a grower, look at the fields, look at the weeds, and what can I do next year that's going to improve weed management compared to what I did this year already? How can I improve? And that's what we should think about for crop production, but also for weed management on an annual basis.
Always great to see you, and I appreciate your insight.
Well, thank you for your time.
That's Dr. Bryan Young with Purdue University. I'm Megan Grebner with the Operation Weed Eradication report on Brownfield.